So thank you, Secretary Jewell. That was a wonderful speech to reaffirm what is so important on the issues that we talk about, to reaffirm what's so important with venues like Capitol Hill Ocean Week, and to reaffirm the need for all of us to support the kinds of initiatives that Secretary Jewell is championing through the Department of the Interior, and that NOAA is championing under Dr. Sullivan, and that the White House is championing under President Obama and John Podesta. The fact that we are engaged and interested and supportive provides a great deal of help for what they are trying to accomplish. It's now my great pleasure to bring up the next panel. In fact, I'll invite you guys up right now as I introduce the moderator of the panel, Keith Lawrence. Keith is the Senior Director of Conservation International's Seascapes program. I'll invite you to read his full bio in the program. But I'll mention that he has been leading a dialogue on this very issue of green economies and talking about it at a scale that is really essential and that really can see a transformation in the way businesses think about these issues, following on the remarks of Secretary Jewell. Just to remind you, we have volunteers with question cards up and down the aisle. I invite the folks watching on Oceans Live to use the chat room for their comments and questions, and they'll come up to the moderator during the session for discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over to you guys.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Welcome, everybody, to this afternoon's session, Rethinking Business as Usual. Welcome to everybody online, all of you in the room. Looking forward to some great discussion and some good questions. Please do fill in the question cards and submit some questions online too. So I'd like to introduce my two panelists today. Firstly, sitting next to me, Adam Davis. Adam is a partner and also Director of Research Policy and New Markets for Ecosystem Investment Partners, who are a private equity fund manager investing in wetlands, rivers, and endangered species projects around the US, and so we'll look forward to hearing about that. Adam also co-founded the Ecosystem Marketplace, which is an online platform for market-based instruments like this, and also was recipient of the Ecological Society of America Corporate Award in 2002. So Adam, welcome. And also Sophia. Sophia is head of sustainability for JetBlue Airways, so we're very pleased to have you here. Sophia works not just on corporate social responsibility for JetBlue, but also on how we can really ally positive environmental impact with the organization's bottom line. She's also worked on lead building codes, life cycle analysis of products, and she's fluent in Mandarin, although I'm hoping you're going to speak in English today. That would be useful. Okay, great. So just a quick overview of the topic. Clearly, our oceans are not just important to us, but they're also valuable to a variety of economic sectors. Anyone who's worked on ecosystem service valuation is aware of the famous Costanza et al. Paper of 1997, and some of you might have seen that there was a recent update of that published just this month. It puts the whopping number of $145 trillion a year as the global value of services coming from ecosystems worldwide. And more than half of that value comes from our oceans and mangrove systems, with some particularly high values for coral reefs and for mangroves. And I mean, these numbers are useful mainly just for alerting us to the scale of and the size of these values. Some of those values are very tangible. They directly feed into economic uses. Others are more intangible, such as the value of biodiversity itself, the recreation that we might, or aesthetic and cultural values that we derive from marine spaces. But even these underpin economic services and economic sectors. So this session really kicks off a series of 3 sessions that are about that and about the different economic sectors that use the oceans and the way that the private sector can play a role. The other 2 coming up are one on energy, which is later this afternoon, and then another on fisheries, which is tomorrow morning. So while we can touch on those sectors in this session, they'll be dealt with in more detail later. But clearly other sectors that are important and that we will dive into in more detail include tourism and recreation, coastal protection, climate change mitigation and adaptation, pollution absorption, and more. So For me personally, I work at Conservation International. We're a global environmental group. We have the privilege of having teams in about 30 or so countries worldwide, doing great work all over the place, including in Hawaii. That's our only engagement in the United States itself. And we understand some of these issues because we partner with local businesses, with community organizations and so on in those places, but we also partner with corporate partners, people like Disney, ConocoPhillips, Veolia Corporation, and others, really trying to look for those win-win solutions where organizations gain some benefit whilst giving something back. So with that, I'll pass over to Adam for some opening remarks. So Adam,
Great.
Please take it away.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that nice introduction. Is this on? Great, thank you. Well, it's a real honor to be here today and to follow Secretary Jewell, and a genuine pleasure to speak with you and to be able to share my perspective. I probably have a somewhat unique perspective for this conference because I don't work in the ocean. I don't work for the government or an NGO or even a seafood company. The company I work for is called Ecosystem Investment Partners, and we're a private equity fund manager. But I hope it will be relevant, our work will be relevant for you at this conference because the investment we do is right at the intersection of ecological restoration and efficient compliance with environmental laws. To make a very long story short, my partners and I have raised $200 million to invest in land around the United States to restore it to a standard set by government in order to provide efficient compliance for third parties. So that compliance is primarily with Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. So those are the no net loss of wetlands provisions. And as a result of those provisions, we are able to invest in wetlands, streams, and endangered species habitat to earn credits that then can be used by third parties. To give them compliance more efficiently, it takes about half the time to permit a project if you purchase credits from an already completed project. So it's more efficient for the people who purchase credits, but also more effective ecologically because we concentrate the restoration in larger scale projects that often have contiguous protected areas to them. And so we're able to create landscape scale effects from conservation rather than smaller projects that have been more typical in the past. These credits that we earn from restoration projects are real things. They're real property rights that we transact with people who need permits, but they represent real things too. They represent not just ecological success criteria set by the government agencies, including restoration of hydrology, plantings, and so on, but they also represent legal and financial assurances. So permanent protection of the land and endowments that go with the land. So even if we were to go out of business, there are still endowments that provide for long-term monitoring and maintenance of the restoration projects that we're involved with. I'm going to touch on some issues regarding the scale of the restoration industry, some constraints on the type of investment that comes in, and some opportunities for growth. But first, I want to show you some slides from a restoration project that's going on right now, as we're sitting here, in the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, in order to make this all more tangible for you. I've got just a few slides, so it won't take long. But you can see on the monitors here the location of the Chef Mentor Pass property, just to the east of New Orleans. The property is located on the East Orleans Land Bridge, which is just between Lake Pontchartrain, above New Orleans, and the open waters of the Gulf to the east. It's, as you can see, directly adjacent to the Bayou Sauvage National Wildlife Refuge, and there are a number of other large protected areas in the vicinity. The property was in private hands. It had originally been owned by CSX Railroad, then came into the hands of another private owner. We purchased it in 2012. And it's badly in need of restoration. It's a priority in the Coastal Master Plan for the state of Louisiana, and these next three slides will show you why. Along with the rest of the Louisiana coast, the property is eroding and subsiding. This is an aerial from 1952. This is an aerial from 2008. And this is an overlay of the two. So this shows the amount of change on this 16,500 acre property over just 50 years, 56 years. The light green areas are areas that are eroding and subsiding from healthy marsh to badly degraded low marsh. And the dark green areas are actually open water. So this is areas of open water that are growing in size on the property. Predictions are that without serious efforts at restoration, the entire land bridge will essentially go away, and the waters of Lake Pontchartrain will be exposed to direct storm surge and other storm events coming from the Gulf. And of course, there's the loss of the habitat on the 16,000 acres itself. So what we're doing is we're investing private capital, first in acquiring the land, and then in restoration. These are called marsh buggies. There are over 30 guys working 24/7 at the property today. What the marsh buggy is doing is building a dike or berm around one of these pockets of open water that is formed. That's a dredge that's now working offshore in Lake Bourne. These are major pieces of equipment that dredge material from the bottom of Lake Bourne, pumping it through 1.5 miles of continuously welded steel pipe. And that's the material pouring out into this previously open water area. And you can see in the background the land starting to form. Condition of the permit is that we establish heights for the material once it's settled that will provide for basis for plantings and natural growth over time. And you can see from this aerial, the center part of the slide there is land actually being reformed in one of these previous open water areas. Our project is doing 500 acres of restoration right now with private capital on private land to a government standard. And while I think it's fair to say that no solution on the Gulf Coast is truly permanent, what we're doing here at the land bridge is buying some time for Lake Pontchartrain and for New Orleans, while society figures out the bigger and tougher issues, like the ultimate disposition of Restore Act dollars and things like replumbing the lower Mississippi to allow sediment flows to reoccur. These are big generational issues, and they take a long time. So having capital that can move quickly is an important part of a bigger solution, I think. So that's the ultimate goal, is high-quality restoration. As I say, we're doing 500 acres now on this 16,500 acre property. We're permitted for 1,000 acres of restoration. So we'll get to that additional 500 acres in the coming years. But there's potential for 7,000 to 8,000 acres of restoration on this property alone. So I'm going to close my remarks with just a couple comments for the discussion and hopefully spark some ideas about what constitutes success and what stands in the way. So the first point is about the investors. So in our latest fund, which is $181 million, about half the investors are pension funds, state pension funds and European government pension funds. The other half of the investors are university and foundation endowments and private family offices. And you can be sure that other pension funds are watching the state and European pension funds that are currently invested, and other endowments are watching the endowments that are currently invested. To the extent that existing investors can make a return on investment, a fair return on investment that's risk adjusted, then we can get more capital. And there's literally no limit to the amount of capital that can come into these markets if returns are reasonably predictable and risks can be managed. People want to participate in these things. The whole impact investing world is growing rapidly, but it's quite limited now in what you can invest in. It's almost all in renewable or alternative energy, and opportunities to participate in land-based conservation and other forms of environmentally sustainable activity are limited. So new asset classes like this activity called mitigation banking are quite important to investors. The second point is that our thesis, our investment thesis, is entirely dependent on government action. It's entirely dependent on consistent and predictable enforcement of environmental laws. It doesn't require government expenditure to actually capitalize the work, but it does require that people who impact resources under the Clean Water Act are required to mitigate in a complete and thorough way to justify the kind of investment that we're making. And these are public goods. So while supply is mostly what people talk about in the environmental markets conversation, everybody would like to have their project funded. It's really the demand that government creates by requiring compliance or literally by procurement mechanisms. The way Secretary Jewell was just talking about the $100 million in coastal grants. So direct procurement or compliance mechanisms can provide demand, but I think a lot of the conversation needs to focus on demand rather than supply in order to pull rather than push the string. And there's every reason to do this. A recent jobs study from the University of Virginia shows 221,000 jobs and $25 billion in economic activity every year in the United States from ecological restoration. It's a great example that shows that environmental regulation doesn't just kill jobs. Recognition of value through environmental law can create jobs and create economic activity. So I think there's every reason to support these environmental markets. And the last point is that the Clean Water Act no net loss program that creates mitigation banking has been around for about 20 years. The policy has been refined. Over 1 million acres have been protected on private land with private dollars as a result of the incentives in the Clean Water Act. It's a very successful program in many ways, and the recent rule in 2008, promulgated by the EPA and the Corps, have improved that regulation and closed some loopholes and tightened up some problems that existed previously. It's good public policy. But we can go beyond the Clean Water Act, no net loss of wetlands. There are many environmental laws that require, in the end, some kind of ecological restoration to occur. The Endangered Species Act, total maximum daily load, or TMDL requirements under Clean Water Act Section 401, and natural resource damage requirements. So all require, at the end, something that looks like this, something that looks like wetland restoration, stream restoration, or habitat restoration. And we can use the same mechanisms that are now working in the 404 program to expand them to other forms of environmental regulation to get more investment and faster environmental restoration. Last thing, there's a quote from the Presidential Executive Order Implementation Program. This is the executive order that President Obama signed in March 2012 on improving performance of federal permitting. The steering committee for the implementation plan was led by OMB and CEQ, and members included NOAA and Interior. And the report talks about interagency coordination and planning, but it also talks a lot about mitigation. And I'll just quote one sentence here. It says, as a recommendation, expand the consideration and application of mitigation banks to provide compensation for other types of resource impacts, which may include impacts on candidate species and injured resources within the natural resource damage context. So the interagency panel that is overseeing the executive order is specifically recommending this kind of thing. It's a great green light as far as we're concerned for the industry. It's a great signal to investors, and we look forward to working with you all on coastal restoration projects, and maybe you can help us figure out how to invest in the ocean someday too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. So we'll hand straight over to Sophia.
Yeah, and I thought flying planes was hard enough, but then I saw the dredging pictures, and I think I'll stick with airlines. My name is Sophia. I'm in charge of JetBlue's sustainability practices, as well as our relationship to using natural resources and our impact on the environment. Briefly, to set the scene for you, when JetBlue talks about corporate responsibility and sustainability, we're really looking to tie those concepts to three things. One, our customers on our flights. Two, our flights, our product itself. And three, the communities and the islands and the areas we fly to. When we talk about sustainability, we do it a little bit differently than many corporations, which will frame it as green or doing the right thing. Of course, I naturally agree with those, but I see JetBlue more engaging in sustainability simply because it is good long-term planning. It is good long-term planning for us as people, and it is certainly good long-term planning for our business and our bottom line, which I'll get into more in a bit. When JetBlue began focusing on oceans specifically within our ecosystem, it was because we looked at our flight route and we found that 1/3 of our routes are going to the Caribbean. And these are flights very frequently from New York, from Boston. We're flying people who already live on the ocean to other parts of the ocean. So clearly there is something special about these clear, beautiful tropical waters. And it is worth reminding everyone in this room, and certainly I remind the tourism industry as well all the time, we know that sun, sea, and sand sells. The wider, the whiter the beach, the more clear and turquoise the water, people want to see their pedicure as they take their picture of their feet. And this is really a fundamental backbone of JetBlue's business. So the tourism industry is very used to focusing on this group of people, very used to catering to their needs and making sure everyone has access to that type of environment. We would generally refer to this type of tourist as your mainstream tourist, your average tourist, the one everyone can count on to buy a ticket and book a hotel. Now, the eco-tourists, on the other hand, those are the divers, the surfers, and maybe the snorkeling, maybe the people going to Costa Rica, small minority, not going to fill a plane. The first thing we're doing at JetBlue is reclassifying those types of tourists. Every single tourist that gets on a plane or a cruise ship to the Caribbean is an eco-tourist, is someone who cares about the environment. They are not flying our planes to Detroit, where we do fly. Houston, also not as popular as St. Lucia. So the change in conversation within JetBlue is to begin to think of the majority of our customers as environmentalists, as eco-tourists. That's the first thing. The second thing we're doing specifically connecting to oceans is we are measuring the obvious. We know that folks will pay more to go on vacation to Jamaica than they will to see grandma in Dakota. And we have the numbers, I have the dollar signs and Excel spreadsheets. We know where we want to open more routes and why. What we're trying to do is go beyond saying that people would rather go on vacation than a business trip, and taking our industry revenue standard, which is called RASM, revenue per available seat mile. This is what the entire industry focuses on. It's what the industry runs on. And we're trying to look at per route, how much, what percentage of each route's RASM is directly attributable to a clean and healthy ecosystem, specifically in the Caribbean. How much money per seat, per flight is JetBlue making because that beach is wide and white, because the water is clear and turquoise? And it is certainly the concept which I work on with the Ocean Foundation, in which the Ocean Foundation and JetBlue co-created, stands on the shoulders of valuing ecosystem services. But when Mark Spalding from the Ocean Foundation and I were talking about this, it was looking at the issue as, why is $1 trillion not changing anything? I can tell my CEO that the oceans are worth how many $1 billion, but it's too distant, it's too far, and it's too big a number, it's too far away to create change. So the first thing we need to do is bring it down to scale. And then the third thing we're doing in connection to oceans is partnering with folks who know what they're doing, like the Ocean Foundation, like a lot of people in this room and the organizations you represent. We are very good at getting you to where you want to go, very good at getting you to the Caribbean in February. Not as good as knowing which mangroves are healthy and holding the beach together, why one beach has a tide that brings up plastic and waste and another doesn't. Ultimately, we are going to marry our RASM per route with the health of the ecosystem directly around the resorts and the cruise lines our customers are flying to. And it is our sincere hope that by connecting those things on that micro scale, we will begin to make a natural argument and have natural motivation for further conservation, not because it is the right thing to do, but because it is good long-term planning.
Great. Thank you very much. Great. Well, thanks both of you. I think we've heard some really interesting points, and we're going to open it up to questions now. I have a few in front of me here, so keep them coming in. But I think we sort of heard like two main mechanisms, I think, as to how the private sector can contribute towards us achieving our public goals and environmental goals of the things that we want from these ecosystems. And on the one hand, it's about understanding how those ecosystems and services underpin business models and bottom lines, and what that means for aligning the interests of the private sector with those other interests that we might have and objectives that we might have, and what that can mean about leveraging the power of the private sector, JetBlue being one example, of course. And the other being generating investment and generating capital to invest in these systems more directly. So looking forward to a discussion on this. So Adam, there's a couple of questions for you to start with, I think. Actually, a couple of similar questions here. One is about whether there's opportunities to consider, I think you actually answered this one to an extent, but opportunities to consider similar projects in the marine environment with credits, not necessarily limited to the Clean Water Act, but National Marine Sanctuaries Act and some of the other ones that you mentioned. So whether there's any opportunity to elaborate on that. And then a related question about efforts, whether there are efforts to extend this model to other ecosystems around the world, maybe outside of the US as well. And this questioner asks about tropical rainforests in Central and South America as one example of that.
Great questions. So on the first one, in terms of the range of environmental issues that we might be able to address, or the private capital, not we as ecosystem investment partners, but the restoration industry might be able to address. The primary requirement is a clear property right, a private property right. So in the case of the land-based restoration that we do, an acre is the basic unit of measure, and then a functional acre is based on the quantitative assessment methods that are used, the functional assessment methods that are used by the agencies to measure ecological uplift. So those, essentially the functions provided by an acre are the basis of a credit, along with those legal and financial assurances that I mentioned. In an ocean environment, of course, there's been some experimentation with property rights, and I think catch shares is the most advanced mechanism that I'm aware of anyway. And I know that there's discussion about ocean zoning as well, but I'm not aware of a way to invest in a specific ecological result that could create a quantifiable benefit that would be of use to a third party. If there was a way to do that, then I think perhaps the ocean environment could be a place where private capital could come. And I do think that the model from the Clean Water Act provides some structural elements, right? So some object lessons, if you will, or principles about how to design an environmental market that work. So we could look to that. And I think there's plenty of opportunity on the coast, if not directly in the marine environment. In terms of internationally, I mean, the thing that drives our business is the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, natural resource damages provisions of oil pollution and Superfund. And those laws don't exist in other countries. But there's no reason that they couldn't. And I guess one of my great hopes is that success breeds success. And that to the extent we create a working model that really solves environmental problems and leverages new sources of finance for conservation and restoration, that other people will pick that up and create the regulatory structures that allow it to happen in other places.
That's great, thanks. So a question for both of you. I think you might have slightly different spins on it, but one directly links to what you were just saying, and it's about how we achieve scale. How do we do more than the individual projects? I know obviously you do more than individual projects already, but how do we achieve greater reach, and what are the lessons that we've learned from what we've done already? And Sophia, there's a question for you that directly links to that, and that's where did I put it? Your studies and analysis of economic benefit of ecosystems per flight route is fascinating. Do you see this initiative perpetrating throughout the entire airline industry? So in both cases, it's really about how do we take it beyond what we're doing individually and achieve more scale.
The scalability of this idea is, first, obviously we're starting with butts and seats, and then you go to heads and beds, which is hotels. And from there you have your ancillary, you have your restaurants, you have your day trips out of the resort. You get to your fishing expeditions, you get to your snorkeling expeditions. It's as scalable as the scale of it and its scalability is as large as any industry that has an economic unit and a measurement that is not currently being directly connected to ecosystem services. So within the tourism industry, you can immediately think of four: the airlines, the hotels, the cruise lines, and the ancillaries. And then I would hope that the tourism industry's collective effort and this kind of thinking could then go on to inspire other consumer industries.
That's great. I think this is a very important question because the scale of the problems are so large. We need to scale up the solution sets. And I think we need, first of all, to look at what has worked in terms of both the quantitative assessment methods for scoring ecological uplift, the supply and demand issues about connecting impacts to offsets, and then expanding those to other regulatory problems, with the ultimate goal of providing ways of measuring the benefits from investment in restoration that can be used for federal procurement as well, right? So right now there's a private sector developing, a restoration industry, if you will, that's providing offsets for unavoidable impacts under the Clean Water Act. That could be used for other regulations that could bring capital in. So that's one model. But once you have a way of measuring an impact and an offset that's developed in a regulatory context, why not use that same unit of measure for conservation reserve program or other conservation title spending in the Farm Bill, or for the regional environmental initiatives like the Everglades and the Chesapeake Bay and the Puget Sound and the Mississippi River and so on? We're spending a lot of money now, but I actually believe we don't know what we're buying with the money we're spending to a large extent, because we're buying projects rather than scientifically verifiable units of the things which the science tells us fix the problem, right? If we could buy units of the things that the science tells us fix the problem, that would be very efficient and effective procurement of environmental benefit. And I think it would make federal dollars go farther, and I think it would create better environmental results. But I think there's a big connection between those two things, because the units of measure are coming out of the regulatory context.
Great.
That's brilliant. That's really good.
Yeah, thanks. So I've got a lot of questions here. I'm trying to keep up with them all, so thanks everybody. Good one here for you, Sophia. As JetBlue has an increasingly refined sense of the relationship between ocean health and RASM, how will it invest in improving ocean health? Is the JetBlue executive team ready to make these investments?
Yeah, so I'm not authorized to speak on behalf of our executive team.
Right.
I will speak on behalf of the authorized plan, the strategy, and the JetBlue culture, which any JetBlue crew member can speak on and is certainly authorized. As a company that brings tax revenue to island nations in the Caribbean, we have good existing healthy relationships with tourism industry, with the tourism ministers, with the transport ministers, with economic data to go to them with. We can explain why co-investing in restoration and or preservation is an economic benefit to JetBlue and by extension to the local government. And yes, JetBlue is ready to do the analysis. We are currently doing the analysis, and yes, we are ready if the numbers can show the value of the mangrove, can show the value of the coral reef. We are ready to take that information on a roadshow, share it with our friends and our elected officials who do represent the interests of these very countries and communities we're flying to. And ask, again, this is back to point 3, partnering with the people who know what they're doing, asking where is the most efficient unit we can buy. Yes.
Thanks very much. So a real variety of questions coming in. Somebody asks, how much is a duck worth? Not sure I know the answer to that.
I don't think people fly to see ducks, which, I mean, that's exactly the point.
Yeah.
Yes, I get the question, but if you show me which route on our flight map exists because people are going to look at ducks, we can estimate how much a duck is worth.
Actually, I'd like to take a crack at that question.
Okay, please do.
To say that I really believe ecosystem services theory is correct. That the ecological services provided by intact ecosystems are worth money because they provide life support services. What could be more important? And some people have argued that you shouldn't put a price on things because there's already inherent value or there's spiritual value to these places and so on. And I might agree with that in my heart, but I'll tell you, I think it's too late. I think we've already put a price on everything as real estate or natural resources. So every acre in the world is worth some number, even if it's in the public trust. You can have it appraised. There's a way to evaluate the financial value in terms of real estate, building on it, or natural resources, taking from it. But there's no value for stewarding and taking care of it. That's why it's in the public trust. We use tax dollars to do that, which is fine as far as the tax dollars go. But there's a lot of private lands that need protection and restoration one way or another. 80% of the Gulf Coast is in private hands. And so how do we make ecosystem services come true so that the duck is not worth zero? And last point on that one, in Alaska, in Prince William Sound, those rocks in that shoreline were worth zero until the day the oil was spilled on them. Once the oil was spilled on them, all of a sudden, we put all kinds of resources into evaluating and analyzing and figuring out what they were doing and so on. But my contention is that they were worth a lot of money before we spilled oil on them. And I think our laws reveal the value in different sort of funny ways, but we can tailor the ways that the value is revealed to get action to occur before there's a spill or damage. So I think it's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah, I like this value of a duck line. Let's dig a little deeper. So I have a follow-up question for you then. So in terms of wetland banking, in terms of if you're looking to trade off different areas of wetland against each other, maybe there's some damage happening over here, but there's some restoration happening over here. How do you ensure that those two areas provide the same amount of services, including habitat for ducks, let's say, or which could be an endangered species of duck too, of course, which might change the value of the duck?
So the scoring methods that are used under the Clean Water Act 404 program are quite sophisticated. There are different functional assessment methods that are used by different districts of the Corps because the ecology in different regions of the country is different and so on. But these methods require rigorous baseline setting and then analysis of the loss or uplift from either damage or restoration, right? And so while you can never replace the full function and value of something that you damage, if you allow permanent destruction of something, you can take stuff that's previously been degraded and bring it back to health. We see that in very exciting ways in our industry all the time. And the theory of allowing third-party mitigation really is part of a train of history. So at the beginning, no mitigation was allowed at all. Then we went to on-site, in-kind mitigation. So if you did a highway project, you'd do the restoration right next to the highway, which of course attracted the wildlife to the highway. And there were problems with that. So then it went to off-site mitigation, and now it's gone to concentrating mitigation. So it really can work because it allows infill development in places where the ecological value of a wetland is quite limited, and using the revenue from that development to then drive restoration in the greenbelt or watershed. So while there's no perfect way, the perfect way would be to not do anything as our country goes from 300 million to 400 million people. But let's assume that those people are going to show up and that they're going to have houses and we're going to have to build roads for them and so on. We're going to have impacts. The energy exploration in this country is extraordinary right now. There are tremendous impacts from this. So if we're going to have impacts, the best we can do is to measure them and fully offset them. That internalizes the cost of the damage. it makes the activity more ethical, and if we do it right, we can actually make permitting more efficient at the same time.
Great. So we need to know how many ducks, and we do indeed need
We
to
do.
know how much the duck is worth or
We
what
do.
it's providing. Sophia, one for you. How do you articulate and connect JetBlue to the environmental market as part of your product mix branding? I guess it's a broader question about communications and what we can learn about product branding and how to communicate these issues more broadly.
Very carefully, especially at this point. When communicating issues like this to the wider public, so the 31 million customers who fly us every year, I try and do it quickly, cleanly, and positively. I would consider this an in-depth, knowledgeable conversation, and one you might not want to be having if you had your 3 children with you and had taken a red eye. So the general message is quite similar to what Adam just said. We are going to grow. We are going to have impact. We, as JetBlue, can help you offset or mitigate that impact quickly and affordably and easily. And all the customer needs to do is click yes when they're buying that ticket. Now, behind the scenes, it's my job to work with folks like Adam or people who have carbon sequestration projects, make sure that everything is true and measurable, bring all that back into one marketing sentence. I believe the marketing sentence on our website at the moment is, climate change is a reality, hot air doesn't have to be. And trying to get really to that clean communication with the customer, who quite frankly might have absolutely no interest in this topic.
Great, thanks. And on the topic of communications, I want to give a very quick plug to my colleagues who have a booth out there for the Ocean Health Index, which I think you'll see some great products out there, and there's also a really nice website looking at the value, not so much the value, but trying to put a score on different aspects of ocean health for countries around the world, obviously including the United States and overseas territories of the United States. So take a look at their booth. There's some good work out there.
I'll just back up that plug from the corporate side. Anytime information is presented so beautifully, clearly, and succinctly, like the Ocean Index, it truly benefits the marketing and branding teams within companies. And a perfect example of this is the Climate Reality Project's new website. If you haven't seen that, that's kind of like gorgeous, endless scrolling pictures is the communication.
Sure. Great. So another one for you, which is JetBlue using its market power to ensure its supply chain takes sustainability seriously?
Yeah. We are. It is not the focus of my strategy the way some of the topics we just discussed and described are. We are writing these standards into our supply chain, and something we talk about a lot internally and I preach up to the executives is when you go shopping for yourself, you get one vote. You're spending $1 for one sandwich for one can of tuna for your family. Anytime JetBlue buys anything, we get over 30 million votes. We are buying pillows for 30 million people. We are buying water bottles for 30 million people. And putting those types of questions into our RFPs, requests for proposals, if you're familiar with this kind of mass buying system, is a signal to Coca-Cola Incorporated, is a signal to Procter & Gamble that, quote unquote, we care, and we can care as much as the flying public cares.
Thank you. So I think this one's for you, Adam, and it's from our online audience, which is good to see. So much of restoration investment is most often used reactively as a penalty for bad behavior or in response to a disaster. How do we shift restoration investments to support proactive actions?
Well, that's a great question, and I think we can do both. There's a hierarchy in the 2008 mitigation rule that I mentioned that the EPA and the Army Corps had promulgated. And that hierarchy prioritizes mitigation completed in advance. And that's really what provides the incentive for us to take investor capital and put it on the ground in a restoration project before there are impacts. Because we only earn the credit to sell to a third party after the success criteria are met. So there's actually a credit release schedule. So as we achieve hydrology, as we achieve the plantings, we earn more credits, but we can then sell to third parties. So it provides a real incentive for restoration to occur before impacts occur. Now, people are still allowed to do their own sort of do-it-yourself mitigation or permittee responsible mitigation. They don't have to buy a credit from a bank. But the reason banks are prioritized is because in the case of permittee responsible or other types of mitigation, the money is collected from the impact, and then the restoration occurs sometimes years later. In the case of natural resource damages, there have been $477 million collected from responsible parties under Oil Pollution or Superfund Acts, which has not been able to find the ground yet. So the Department of Interior is very cognizant of this and working on it hard, but to date there's $477 million that's been collected. The average rate of expenditure is about $30 million a year in projects. So it's a problem when fines and fees are assessed and they can't find restoration projects because of all the complexity involved in executing these projects. So putting incentives in place to allow early action is a great idea.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. I think we have about 5 minutes left, so time for a couple more questions. Another one for you, Adam. How do your restoration projects coordinate with the conservation goals of federal and state agencies that have resource management responsibilities? And I guess this links to some of the points you were making earlier about compliance with environmental law and so on.
Well, there's two points I'd like to make. The first is that we are very proud of our relationships with the leading conservation NGOs. So we have a signed memorandum of agreement with the Nature Conservancy, also with the Conservation Fund, with Ducks Unlimited, with the Environmental Defense Fund. We work really closely with these folks. And the reason why is that they, did I say Ducks Unlimited?
Yes, you did. I thought you were going to say Duck Dynasty.
But these folks have tremendous resources in terms of conservation real estate in every state in the nation. They also, to a large extent, define high conservation value in conservation with the government agencies responsible for these trust resources. So they often identify places that need to be conserved or restored, but they don't necessarily have the capital to do it. So we're essentially providing a private finance solution for the goals of the NGOs. So we have a very good symbiotic relationship. And in terms of the role of the public agencies, every one of our banking instruments is signed off on, not just by the Army Corps of Engineers, but by the EPA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and state Fish and Wildlife agencies. Often NOAA and NIMS are involved as well. So it's a true interagency review team that has to approve the siting of the restoration project and the standard for restoration.
Right, yeah. And I think that's where this gets exciting, right? Is it's the linkage between the roles of the public agencies and the power of the private sector to leverage things. And when you get those two things harnessed well together, then we can create real change. So that's exciting. I guess we'll finish with a sort of more general question, which is about what trends and changes you've seen over the years working in this sort of field, and how have things changed, and how do you see things going forward, sort of big picture wise?
Yeah, sure. So from my perspective, I watch trends and changes in corporate responsibility. We obviously went from the I don't know what that is, that's for moms on PTO boards, to slow integration. Well, it's harder to operate if the local community is annoyed at me. And then, finally moving on to, it would be good if we did philanthropy because it improves our relationships and our employees like it. And then enters kind of the environmental movement into the corporations, out from the cold into the center of the system, and you get, it's good for the earth, this kind of very far away, do it for your great-grandchildren, do it for some morality's sake, that's quite intangible, to what I love right now, which is there is no difference between social responsibility and environmental responsibility when it comes to companies. This recognition of the true system between people, the ecosystems, and our profits. And that's where I would say we sit right now.
great. That's very encouraging. I would say that the sort of biggest takeaway for me over the past 15 years or so of being involved in applied ecosystem services theory is how much we've moved from theory. It was only in 1997 that Gretchen Daly wrote Nature's Services, and in 2002, The New Economy of Nature. And if you look back on those books and sort of remember the level of discussion about, are ecosystem services real? Could they be measured? How could someone actually get paid? I mean, this was only 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And today, there are transactions occurring where the value of nature is being revealed, and incentives are being created for investment in conservation and restoration. So I think we've come a tremendous way in a relatively short time.
Great, thanks very much. And I would just add to that I think the trend that I'm seeing is just so much more attention to our oceans, so much more realization of the importance of ocean spaces and the different uses of them. I think the next session, which we'll talk about energy, is one of the reasons for that. We're seeing offshore exploration and use of the oceans, but of course it's not the only one. And just generally, a lot of governments around the world are starting to think more about oceans, and it's important for us to think about conservation and sustainable use of those resources as being just as important as it is on land. So definitely a big rise in awareness. So we'll end it there. Thanks very much to both panelists, and thanks to everyone's attention.
It was a lot of fun.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.